My special guest is our friend. He's been on the show a couple of times, Craig Shirley. And not only is Craig a star athlete, which I did not know, he's also one of the most renowned experts these days, or authorities, if you will, on the subject of Ronald Wilson Reagan and some of these treaties that the president negotiated, again, against the wishes of many in his own party. Right, Craig? How are you, brother?
Good, Mike. How are you?
I am well.
Yes, I was a star athlete, but it was many years ago. It is a little bit more complicated than that because Reagan, you were absolutely right, hated the idea of nuclear war. And as a matter of fact, in his farewell address or his remarks at the 76th convention after losing the nomination to Gerald Ford, he gave a 9-minute extemporaneous speech, and he talked about horrible missiles of destruction, destroying virtually the civilized world. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty close. And he believed that nothing was more dangerous the future of mankind than nuclear war. That and,
right.
and human enslavement. And that was the great struggle of the Cold War. Was that how do you get what you want, which is the Soviets to stop enslaving people and to lay down the nuclear weapons, and that was his goal, and ultimately he achieved it. But he achieved it not through weakness, but through strength, which sounds like a tortured cliche, but it's also true. When he took office in 1981, he didn't meet with the Soviets until 1985, 4 years, and there was constant left-wing pressure. Why isn't he talking to the Soviets? Why isn't he negotiating with the Soviets? Well, he didn't want to. Of course, he joked at the time they kept dying on him, which was true. Brezhnev and then Chernyenko and others kept dying before the rise of Gorbachev in 1985. But he also needed time to rearm and re-prepare. He never wanted to negotiate from a position of weakness. He wanted to negotiate from a position of strength, and then he dealt with the Soviet.
Now, and when he was dealing with the Soviets, when he made those trips to Iceland, to Reykjavik Island, and there was more than one trip, and there was more than one meeting. He ultimately, when he was proposing these treaties, or when they were in the I guess it was the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation talks, which I think President Carter actually began, or maybe Nixon began them, and Carter continued.
SALT started under Nixon, continued through Ford and Carter. Reagan junked SALT and initiated START, which wasn't limitations talks, but actual reductions talks, strategic arms reductions talks.
And this is when the Gingriches began to say, hey, this old man's going to get us all killed. He's losing his mind. We can't reduce the number of weapons that we have.
Well, everybody was interesting because I remember at the time Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, who had given up so much to the Soviets, wrote a scathing editorial in the Washington Post eviscerating Reagan for the IMF treaty, which by the way got rid of all nuclear weapons in Western and Eastern Europe and reduced the Soviet threat there immensely, which probably in a way emboldened the later rise of solidarity in Poland, the Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia, and other indigenous revolutions in the Warsaw Pact countries.
And it's also, now you have read President Reagan's diaries. I haven't read. I've only seen excerpts of them, and I don't have the book. Perhaps I should get the book. But in his diaries,
it's available in bookstores.
Okay, I know that. But in his diaries, Craig, in his diaries, what is the mindset going into 85, 86, and 87 as he is having these talks, and he is just being savaged by left. No one is happy with what he is doing, but he
right. For the left, it's not enough, and for the right, it's too much.
Right. So, what is his mindset? What is he thinking when all this is?
Well, he's amused. He's somewhat frustrated. But there was I don't know if you remember there was a Star Trek movie where Spock says to Kirk, there's an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. I don't remember which Star Trek it was, but it was apropos. And only Reagan, after 40 years of being a strong anti-communist, constantly denouncing the Soviets, constantly championing Alexander Solzhenitsyn, constantly championing Lech Walesa. Only Reagan had the political capital, had the political spoons in his pocket to be able to make deals with the Soviets without a conservative revolt in his own party.
And ultimately, when the talks turn to limitations and then to reductions,
yeah.
and it is then discovered that what the president is actually doing is, to quote some people at the time, is to weaken the American position here. This is when the both sides then totally turn on him, and this is where, and then, of course you're the authority, so you tell me. But is this where the dirty and despicable description of the president as being out of his mind, as being senile, as being too old for the job, as being incapable? We might have to invoke, I believe at some point there was talk about invoking the 24th Amendment around, what was going on with that?
Well, but he'd experienced that his whole life. That was nothing new for Ronald Reagan. I just finished a book about his post-presidency on the 15 years called Last Act. It comes out in October of this year.
Okay.
The amount of vitriol and the amount of hatred aimed at Ronald Reagan, who the week of his funeral, from the organized left, a few on the right, but from the organized left, was absolutely astonishing. Everything from senility to Alzheimer's to he was out of it to he was a bad president to he was from academia and from the liberal media. The week of his funeral, it came to a head. Actually, there was no abatement whatsoever. So for Reagan to be denounced, it was nothing new. He was denounced his whole life. So that really didn't bother him all that much. Sometimes he let it get to him. I remember in his diaries he'd had an unpleasant meeting with Senator Lowell Weicker, who was a liberal Republican from Connecticut.
I remember Lowell Weicker.
Sure. And you remember, Lowell Weicker had an ego the size of North America. And Reagan, referred to him in his diaries as a no-good fathead and a schmuck. So there were times when people could bother him or get under his skin, but normally he was pretty cool in the face of personal and professional criticism.
And of course, now if you know the story of Ronald Reagan, and Craig Shirley, who is the author of Rendezvous with Destiny and other books about President Reagan, and is one of Reagan's most accomplished biographers today, is on the Dude Maker Hotline with us. If you know the biographical story, Ronald Wilson Reagan, you know what Craig said to be true about, well, his whole life was like that. Well, it's true. From the time when he was growing up in the Great Depression, and he wanted to hang out with the other kids, but he couldn't because he was living in the room above the butcher shop, and didn't have the same accoutrement that others had. To the time he got into broadcasting and was denied the plum positions, and was instead told, well, you can go do sports. We need somebody to do sports. Oh, okay. Well, I guess that's what I'll go do then. And at the time he got into acting, well, Bill Holden's a little better looking than you, but you'll be good in the supporting actor role.
Well, imagine how to illustrate your point, Mike. Imagine how the world would have changed had Ronald Reagan had just graduated from Eureka College. Right. The local Montgomery ward there in Dixon needed a young man, entry-level floor salesman, to work in the sports department there. Work to sell equipment. Reagan applied for the job. He didn't get it because they awarded it to a local basketball star. Can you imagine how the world would be different had Reagan gotten that job at Montgomery Ward?
Well, can you imagine how the world would be different if he would have gotten some of the starring roles that Tony Curtis got, that Cary Grant got, that William Holden got, that Randolph...
Randolph Scott.
Randolph Scott got.
Yeah,
And
John
Montgomery
Wayne.
Clift, right?
Well, I mean, is that he was cast as lead in Casablanca instead of went to Humphrey Bogart. Can you imagine how the world would have been changed? Possibly had he been Rick instead of Humphrey Bogart.
So all these things, and what's fascinating about this is number one, God always has a plan, and he certainly had one for Ronald Wilson Reagan. And number two,
and Reagan believed
president,
that too, by the way.
Yeah, but the president never, and I named a daughter. I don't know if you know this, Craig. My daughter number 2 is named Reagan. It's spelled correctly. And,
wonderful.
Yeah, well, that's her name, and she knows who her namesake is, and she has lots of Reagan memorabilia. The thing that always fascinated me is it's not the political side of Ronald Reagan, although I am fascinated by that. It's the life story that he seemed to always be able to never get into what we Catholics call despair. He always had some reserve of cheer. He just never let it. He never showed it, anyways, and he let it get to him.
There were a few times, but they're very few and far between. One of the times was in the late 40s. It was during World War II when he tried 3 times to enlist in the active duty, and they wouldn't take him because of
telling him no.
Because of his poor eyesight. So he went in. I mean, he was active duty, but he didn't get into a war zone. He was active duty in the Army, but and he took that badly. He really wanted to go fight. Another time was in the late 40s when at a charity softball game he was sliding into third base and he broke his hip and he was laid up in a hospital for about 6 weeks. And his movie career was starting to fade, and that was another time where he really despaired. But you're right; he had an enviable well of good cheer and good spirits inside of him.
He always did. Hey, Craig, we'll have you back when the new book comes out. And what did you call it?
It's called Last Act. Last Act, the final years and enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan. It's about the 15 years of his post-presidency. There's never been a book written before about the post-presidency, and it centers on the week of the Reagan funeral and really the titanic struggle, Mike, in this country between the elites and the citizenry over the Reagan legacy. The elites wanted to grind it into the ground and make him a grade B actor with premature orange hair and meaningless, and it was all hype and everything. And the citizenry kept pushing back and said, no, this is a man of substance and accomplishment who did great things. It was a titanic struggle.
Yeah, well, he never was one of those elite. I mean, he may have become president, and by default he became an elite, but he wasn't an elite by choice. He was an elite by accomplishment, and that's rare today. Craig, always a pleasure, my friend. We'll talk to you when the book comes out.
Thank you, Mike.
Anytime. Appreciate it. 866-95 Patriot.